been counting bats for a living since 2004. Most people don't know that's a real job, but it is, and in Texas, it pays well enough if you don't mind the smell of guano in your hair on date nights. In August 2019, I was working a cave out in the hill country, about 90 minutes west of San Antonio, on a private ranch owned by a family that let researchers in for a token fee and a signed waiver. The colony was somewhere north of 8 million Mexican free-tailed bats. When they came out at dusk, it looked like smoke pouring sideways out of the ground. I'd been on that site for 6 weeks. Same routine every evening. Drive up the ranch road around 6, park by the gate, hike the last mile because the engine noise stresses the colony, set up the acoustic array on the ridge, bat detector, thermal camera on a tripod, 2 GoPros in weatherproof housings, a laptop running kaleidoscope. By 7:15, I'd have a coffee in the folding chair at the mouth of the cave, and I'd wait. You learn to hear the emergence before you see it. There's a buildup. The chitter gets denser inside the cave. Individual squeaks start stacking into this constant wet noise, almost like rain hitting a tin roof from underneath. Then the first scouts come out, a dozen, 100. Then the column starts, and it goes for 40 minutes. That evening, the temperature was 91 at sunset, barometer flat, no wind. I remember writing "typical" in the field log at 7:42. I dated the entry. I always dated entries. At 7:55, there was nothing, not less, nothing. The chitter that should have been building for the last 20 minutes wasn't there. I turned the bat detector up. I checked the batteries. I switched cables. The array was fine. There just wasn't anything to pick up. I stood at the mouth of the cave and listened with my own ears. Cicadas in the mesquite behind me, a cow somewhere on the neighboring property, my own breathing, which suddenly sounded louder than I wanted it to. From inside the cave, absolutely nothing. You have to understand what that means. 8 million animals. Even when they aren't emerging, you hear them. They shift, they grom, they squabble, mothers call pups. It's like standing outside a stadium at halftime. Muffled roar, always there. I stood at that entrance for maybe 4 minutes with my mouth open. Nothing came out, no sound went in. Then I did the thing you're not supposed to do. I clicked on my headlamp and walked in. The main chamber is about 30 yards from the entrance. Down a slope you can walk if you don't mind ducking twice. I know it in the dark. I've mapped it. I could tell you where every survey marker is by feel, so when I stepped in with the red light on, I wasn't nervous, just confused. Professionally confused, if that makes sense. Like when a piece of gear stops working and you already know it's going to be something dumb. The floor was normal. Guano, roaches moving over the guano, the smell you don't get used to no matter what anyone tells you. That was all fine, standard. I looked up. The ceiling was covered, solid brown, wall to wall, the way it always is at dusk before emergence. Millions of little bodies packed shoulder to shoulder. My light caught the eyes, and the eyes caught me back. Thousands of tiny reflections all at once. Not one of them was moving. I don't mean settled. Roosting bats aren't still. They twitch, they scratch, they open and fold their wings, they turn on the perch. A roosting colony at 7:55 in August should look like the surface of a pot about to boil. This looked like a photograph. I stood there and watched for what my watch later told me was 6 minutes. I didn't hear a single squeak. I didn't see a single wing shift. I watched a specific bat, one I could pick out because he was closer to a support column than the rest, and he didn't move a muscle. Not to breathe, not to blink. I could see his eye. It was open, and it was pointed at nothing in particular, and it stayed that way. I said, out loud, okay guys, what are we doing? My voice sounded flat. There was no echo in a cave. There should have been an echo. That was the first moment I felt something in my stomach that wasn't professional curiosity. I took 2 more steps in. I was maybe 40 feet from where the passage narrows and turns off to the deeper section, the one we call the back throat because of how the airflow works when it's cold. I've been down there plenty of times. It goes another 200 yards before it pinches out. Every bat turned its head, not in a wave, not one after the other, all of them at once. like somebody had hit a switch on the whole ceiling and rotated every skull about 40 degrees. The sound of that many small joints moving at the same time was a single, soft click. One click from everywhere above me. They were all looking at the back throat. I don't remember making the decision to leave. I remember being outside the cave and my headlamp being off, and I don't remember turning it off. I remember standing on the ridge next to my folding chair and my hands not being steady enough to close the laptop, so I just carried it open all the way back to the truck. I remember the drive down the ranch road being slower than usual because I kept catching myself holding the wheel too tight. I called my colleague from a gas station in Bandera. I'll call him Reyes because that's not his name. I told him the equipment was acting up and I wanted a second set of hands the next day. I didn't tell him what I'd seen. I don't know why. I remember thinking he'd talk me out of what I was already deciding. We drove up together the next afternoon. Emergence that night was textbook. 7:38 First Scouts, full column by 7:44. Reyes clocked the count at 8.1 million, a hair above the seasonal average. The chitter was there. The echo in the chamber was there. He walked the main room with me and asked why I was sweating so much, and I said the AC in the truck had been out on the drive up. He nodded and didn't push it. We pulled the data from every sensor on site. Barometer, temperature, humidity, 3 separate acoustic loggers, seismic. I even pulled the ranch's weather station a mile north. There was nothing in the window from 7:40 to 8:10 the previous evening. No pressure drop, no infrasound spike, no tremor. The acoustic loggers had recorded the same silence I'd stood in, which at least told me I hadn't imagined it, but they hadn't recorded a cause. We wrote it up as anomalous roost suppression event. That's the phrase. It's a real category. It happens rarely, and the usual suspects are sudden pressure changes or predator presence outside the human hearing range. Neither showed up in the data. The paper, when it came out the following spring, has a paragraph about it. One paragraph. Nobody follows up. Reyes asked me before we left if I wanted to walk the back throat with him while we're down there. Fresh eyes, he said. Could be a collapse, could be a new opening letting something in. I said no. I've been in caves for 15 years. I've crawled through squeezes I had no business being in 3 countries, alone, at night, with worse equipment than I had that afternoon. I have never turned down a walk to a known passage in daylight with a partner, not once, before or since. Whatever those bats heard, I decided I wasn't going to hear it. That was the decision, and I made it standing in the sun with Reyes waiting on me, and I've never taken it back. The colony is still there. I still get the annual counts in my inbox. Numbers are healthy. Nobody has reported another suppression event at that site. I don't work that cave anymore. I gave it to a grad student the following season. She's very good. If she ever noticed anything, she hasn't said. The rig was called Prudence 7, about 90 miles inland from the Beaufort coast, and by December it was already dark almost 20 hours a day. That's the part nobody who hasn't worked up there really gets. It isn't the cold you dress for. It's the dark that starts to sit on your chest after a couple of weeks. I was the well site geologist, that rotation, solo posting. The company had cut a lot after the 2020 crash, and instead of 2 of us on shift, they figured one guy with 18 years on rigs could cover a hole like Prudence 7 by himself. I logged the cuttings, ran the gas readings, checked the shakers, called mud weights back to Anchorage. Normal work, the kind you do half asleep with a coffee going cold on the desk. The hole was depth. We were past 14,000 feet, chasing a formation that had shown promise in the seismic. When you're that deep, the rig gets a personality, the drill string groans, the pumps have a heartbeat. You learn what's normal and what isn't, the same way you learn a car engine. If something's off, you know before you can say why. It was maybe the 9th of December when I first heard it. I was on the catwalk near the wellhead, taking a sample from the shale shaker. My hood was down because I'd been leaning close to the tray, and I heard what I thought was air escaping a fitting somewhere below. A hiss, but with a rise and fall to it, almost like breathing through a bad regulator. I checked the manifold. Nothing hissing. I stood there another minute, and the sound was gone. 2 nights later, I heard it again, and this time I was standing directly over the cellar, which is the concrete pit around the wellhead where all the surface iron sits. The sound wasn't coming from the fittings, it was coming up out of the hole, faint, not steady. It rose for a few seconds, dropped, rose again. I wrote it down in the daily log as acoustic anomaly, likely resonance from string vibration, will monitor. That was the correct thing to write. If you write anything weirder than that in a daily log, the office starts asking questions you don't want to answer at 40 below. But it wasn't string vibration. String vibration has a rhythm, this didn't. It moved the way a conversation moves. Around the 15th, I stopped pretending. I brought a handheld recorder up from my quarters, a little Zoom H1 I use for taking notes when my hands are too cold to write. I sat on the edge of the cellar for maybe 40 minutes with the recorder aimed down into the pipe. My face was close enough that when the pumps kicked, I could feel warm, mud-scented air push up against my chin. That's when the sound started shaping itself. It was voices, plural. I want to be careful about how I say that because I know how it reads, but there were at least 2, maybe 3, and they were speaking English. I could hear the shape of English words, the stresses in the wrong places for any other language I knew. I just couldn't make out the words themselves. It was like listening to a conversation through a wall in a motel, one of those thin motels off the highway where you can tell someone's arguing about money, but you can't quite get the sentences. I sat back on my heels and I laughed out loud because it was ridiculous. I was 53 years old, alone on a rig in the dark, listening to a hole-in-the-ground gossip. Then I leaned closer. I don't know why I did that. If you'd asked me 2 weeks earlier what I'd do if a well started talking, I'd have said I'd walk away and get some sleep. Instead, I put my ear right at the rim of the casing, close enough that the smell of hot drilling mud was in my mouth. One voice pulled forward. The others stayed under it, muddy, like a radio bleeding through another station. But this one got clean, male. Middle-aged, I think, but I couldn't swear to that. It sounded tired more than anything. It said, "Cody," just that. One syllable, then a pause, then the syllable again. Cody. Cody is my son. He was 21 that winter, going to school in Boise. I had not said his name to a single person on Prudence 7. There were only 9 of us on the pad, and I don't talk about my kid at work. I never have. You learn early not to bring your family up into a place like that. It's a superstition, sort of. You keep them separate. I stood up so fast I almost went over backward into the cellar. My legs weren't working right. I remember the sound of my own breath inside the hood and the way the floodlight on the derrick made everything look yellow and unreal. I walked, not ran, back to the trailer. Ran would have meant admitting something. I sat down at the desk with my coat still on, and I played back the recorder. There was nothing on it, just wind, the pumps, and my own breathing. I played it 3 times. The 4th time, I turned it off and sat there with my hands flat on the desk for a long time. The next morning, I told the tool pusher I was hearing something out of the well and wanted a second opinion before I flagged it up. He was a guy named Marlin, 20+ years, patient man. He came out to the cellar with me around noon, which was still full dark. We stood there for maybe half an hour. He heard the hiss. He heard the rise and fall. He shrugged and said it sounded like formation gas moving through a soft spot, which happens, and he'd have the mud engineer look at it. He didn't hear the voices. I stood next to him, and I didn't hear them either, just the hiss. That night, alone again, I heard them, clear as before. The tired voice said Cody's name twice more, and then said something I couldn't parse that ended in what sounded like, the truck. Cody drives a truck, a used Tacoma I helped him buy the year before. I called for a medevac replacement the next morning. I told the company man I thought I was having some kind of episode, possible carbon monoxide in the trailer, and I needed to be pulled. That was easier than the truth. They flew me out on the 18th. I sat with 2 of their engineers in Anchorage before I went home. Nice guys, both of them, one older. I told them everything, including the recorder being empty. They didn't laugh. The older one said deep wells can act like organ pipes under the right conditions. Pressure fronts, layered formations, mud columns of different densities. Sound from the surface can drop into the annulus. bounce off a boundary thousands of feet down, and come back distorted enough to sound like it originated below. He said in rare cases, the reflection can add speech-like modulation to ambient noise. Rare, but documented. They asked if I'd talked about my son near the wellhead recently. I had. 4 days before the first sound, I'd stood on the catwalk on the sat phone with my wife, arguing about whether Cody should come home for Christmas. I was maybe 12 feet from the open casing. The younger engineer said the well could have caught it, held it, given it back to me the way a canyon gives back a shout. I nodded like that made sense. It does make sense. I've been in this work 18 years, and I know sound does strange things underground. I've read the papers since. I still went home a month early. I haven't been back on a rig since that rotation. My wife thinks it's burnout, and I let her think that. Cody is fine. He came home for Christmas. He hugged me in the driveway in Boise, and I held on longer than I usually do, and he laughed at me for it. The thing the engineers couldn't explain, and I didn't push them on, was the part about the truck. I never mentioned Cody's truck on that sat call. I checked the phone records. I checked my own memory. I asked my wife. Nothing about the truck, from either of us, near that well. Probably I'm wrong about hearing it. Probably I filled in a word that wasn't there because I was scared and tired and alone in the dark too long. That's the likeliest thing. That's what I tell people when it comes up, which is almost never. I just don't stand near open holes anymore. The job was supposed to be boring. That was the whole point of taking it. I worked nights at a private storage facility in Long Island City, one of those anonymous industrial buildings you pass 1,000 times without noticing. From the outside, it looked like a self-storage place. Inside, climate control set to 68 degrees and 50% humidity, biometric locks on every hallway, and rows of custom crates worth more than the block the building sat on. Private collections. Museums used the place too, but mostly it was rich people parking their art between auctions and free ports. My shift ran from 9 at night to 7 in the morning. 2 other guards on the floor, but we covered different wings and rarely crossed paths outside of the break room. The whole gig was walking a set route every 90 minutes, checking the humidity readouts on the wall panels and logging anything that looked off. Broken seal, water on the floor, whatever. In 8 months, I'd logged exactly 3 things, and 2 of them were the same dead mouse near a loading bay. I say all this so you understand, I wasn't a jumpy guy. I read on my phone. I ate my sandwich around 2. I knew every corner of that place by sound. The HVAC clicked when it cycled. The freight elevator on the west side hummed at a slightly different pitch than the one on the east. It was quiet in a way that stopped feeling quiet after a few weeks. This was mid-March 2023. I remember because we'd just had that ugly wet snow that turns to slush before it hits the ground, and I'd come in with my boots soaked through. The route that night took me through aisle 14, which held a mixed private collection under a fund I'll just call the fund, since the paperwork on those crates was more redacted than my own tax returns. Most of it was European, old, insured for numbers I tried not to think about. Halfway down the aisle, I noticed one of the crates near the floor had its outer plastic sheeting pulled loose along one corner. Not torn, just loose, like someone had lifted it and set it back badly. The crate itself, wood, was fine, nothing damaged. I got on my knee to check. Under the plastic, through the packing frame, you could see the front of the canvas. That was already wrong. These pieces were supposed to be wrapped face in or double wrapped in glassine. I could see the actual painted surface. Oil painting, landscape, dark trees along the left side, a river or road cutting through the middle, low hills in the back, the kind of thing you walk past in a museum without stopping. The colors had that flat, brown-green quality that old varnish gets. Cracks in the surface, real ones, the kind that spiderweb across old oil. I pulled out my phone to take a photo for the incident log. That's when I actually looked at it. On the horizon, past the hills, there were lights, not stars, not a sunset, little clusters of yellow-white pinpricks in a rough grid, tight together in the center and thinning out toward the edges, the way a city looks from a distance at night. A modern city. You've seen that view from a plane 100 times. I sat there on the concrete floor for probably a minute. I've never studied art. I know what everybody knows. Old paintings have candles in windows sometimes, or a lantern, or a fire on a hill. This wasn't that. The scale was wrong for candles, the spacing was wrong, and the color was that specific cold white you get from sodium and LED mixed together, the way Queens looks from the Manhattan side. The tag on the crate had a year on it. I don't want to give the exact one because it might be identifiable, but it was late 1700s. French, I think, based on the little bit of the paperwork sleeve I could see. I stared at it for a while longer, trying to talk myself into being wrong. The lights could be a village, could be a fire. My eyes could be doing something in the low storage lighting. I took maybe 15 photos, some with the flash off, some with it on. The flash actually made it worse. With the flash on, you could see the individual dots were clean and sharp, not smudged the way the rest of the paint was. They sat on top of everything else. I resecured the plastic sheeting the way I'd found it, loose corner and all. Something told me not to touch it more than I had to. I logged it as damaged outer wrap, aisle 14, crate 44B, no damage to contents observed. I didn't say anything about the horizon. What was I going to write? I finished my shift. I ate my sandwich later than usual, around 4. I did the last 2 rounds without going through 14. At handoff in the morning, I stayed a few extra minutes and asked the day supervisor for the fund's curator's contact. Told him I had photos of a wrapping issue and wanted to send them directly since the piece was high value. He gave me an email without asking questions. That building ran on not asking questions. I sent the photos from the parking lot before I drove home. I put in the body of the email exactly what I'd put in the log, plus 1 extra line at the bottom that said, "Please look at the horizon." He wrote back around 11 that morning while I was trying to sleep. 2 sentences. He wanted to talk on the phone. I called from bed. Older sounding guy, careful with words, the kind of accent that could have been anywhere in Europe. He asked me 3 times to confirm which crate, which aisle, and what time I'd found it. Then he was quiet for maybe 20 seconds. I could hear him breathing. Then he said, "This is a restoration intervention. Someone has added to the painting." I asked him what that meant. He said, "It means the horizon is not original. Someone painted over it recently." He thanked me and hung up. I heard through the day supervisor a couple of weeks later that the fund had pulled the piece for external analysis, pigment tests, whatever they do. The word that came back was that, yes, the lights and a strip of the sky around them were a modern addition, acrylic under a thin oil glaze to match the surrounding varnish. Skilled work, not something you'd see unless you were looking directly at that section under decent light, which nobody would be because the painting had been in storage for 11 years. Who did it, when, and why, they never figured out. The crate had been moved twice in that time between facilities. The chain of custody had gaps. The fund declined to give a statement to anyone, including their own insurer as far as I could tell. The piece went back into a crate and out of the building on a Tuesday morning, and I never saw it again. I still work nights. Different building now, different company. I asked for a transfer a few months after, and nobody made me explain. What I keep thinking about is the person who did it. Somebody sat down with brushes and pigment, worked from a reference, painted a modern skyline onto a 200-year-old landscape, and then put it back in its crate and walked away. Whoever they were fine with the idea that it might sit there another 11 years before anyone noticed. Maybe longer, maybe never. The loose corner of plastic was the only reason I saw it. I've thought about that a lot. Somebody wanted it seen, or somebody got interrupted. I don't know which is worse.